Hi everyone, my name is Allison Trimarco from Creative Capacity Consulting. My friends at Volunteer Connect asked me to make this video to provide you with some resources for making good strategic decisions during these very challenging times. Now, as I'm recording this video, it's about 6 weeks into the COVID-19 crisis. Most of us in the nonprofit sector have spent those 6 weeks making urgent, crisis-oriented decisions about how we can respond to the very, very challenging things that are happening right now. But as we're 6 weeks in, many of us are now starting to turn our attention to thinking about how we're going to manage these circumstances in the long term. And that can be really hard to do because there are so many unknowns in our environment right now. It's just not possible to predict exactly how things are going to play out over the next months or perhaps even a year or more. So I want to give you a tool that can help you try to make those longer range decisions in a way that is as strategic as possible so that those decisions hold up in the long term. Scenario planning is a tool that is most often thought of as a financial planning tool. You sort of think about what you can do based on how much revenue comes into your organization. And the kind of scenario planning that I want to talk about today definitely takes money into account, but it's just one factor in how you use this particular planning tool. This kind of scenario planning attempts to help you build out choices for how you're going to behave based on different factors in your external environment so that you can be more confident that you're prepared to make choices that are good for your mission, for your constituents, and for your long-term impact, even as our external conditions keep changing. So there's a worksheet that goes along with this video. It should be available for download right below it. And I'm going to walk you through the 6 steps of this scenario planning process so that you can hopefully use it within your own organizations to guide some of the important discussions you're having right now. The first step in this exercise is to, frankly, think about why you're even doing it in the first place. What are you trying to find out by doing a scenario planning exercise? You need to have a goal because that'll help keep you on track. So, for example, in this situation, you might be asking yourself a question like, how are we going to go ahead with our strategic plan, even though external circumstances are very difficult right now? Or how do we carry out our programs, even though we can't gather in person right now? So you want to try to shape a question that's going to give scope to your scenario planning. It'll give you an end goal, and that helps the exercise stay more specific. Once you have your question, then you can make a list of the unknown factors that are making your decision-making challenging. And this is the whole purpose of scenario planning, right? Is that there's something going on in the world. At this moment, there are many things going on in the world that we just can't know what's going to happen. And now I want to remind us that uncertainty is not really a feeling, right? Uncertainty in this circumstance is the lack of information that is left over once you have researched a situation as much as you can. So even with all of the very real uncertainty that we're facing right now, before you put a factor on your unknown list, go ahead and research it as much as you can. What are people predicting about different factors? What do people already who are specialists in an area like the stock market or in public health thinking about that might give us a better sense of what uncertainty actually is in each area. For example, unknowns that you might be facing right now: how long will physical distancing orders last? Or will the continued volatility in the stock market make fundraising hard for us in some way? Once you have your list of unknowns, I want you to think about what I call trigger events. And these are things that might happen, that frankly probably will happen, that will give us new information that will make us feel better about making decisions, right? It's going to increase our confidence. And trigger events are not things that resolve all uncertainty. They just give us more information. So for instance, at some point, the governor will make a decision about new physical distancing rules, or your core funders will give you more information about how they plan to fund in the next year. And so you want to just identify those things that could happen that probably will happen, that will provide you with more information. Put a pin in those. We'll need them later in the exercise. This is really the heart of the first stage of scenario planning. You'll see on your worksheet there's a chart that's similar to this. You want to list your unknowns in that first left-hand column. And then you want to think about the best case, the worst case, and the most likely scenario. And sometimes those phrases, best and worst case, might lead us to sort of unrealistic examples that are not helpful to us. So, the best case scenario here is not that COVID-19 disappears and everybody's healthy and everything goes back exactly the way it was overnight, because that's not going to happen, right? We want a best case scenario that might actually happen. What's the best outcome that we can realistically hope for right now? Similarly, it's pretty easy at this moment. I don't know about you, but I'm certainly feeling a lot of anxiety. It's pretty easy to come up with a worst case scenario that's very, very dramatic. Lots of truly terrible things continuing to happen. Probably the worst case that your anxiety can lead you to right now is not the worst case that you are realistically going to have to face. I hope that's true at least. So think about what's the most challenging scenario that you might have to face. That's your worst case. Most likely is the outcome that is, most likely to happen, which is probably somewhere in between the best and the worst, right? So, for instance, your best case scenario for your unknown of physical distancing might be that conditions do start to improve this summer and people start to behave more typically by the fall, right? People start to go out a little bit more. People are willing to gather in crowds a little bit more, small crowds, but crowds nonetheless. That's probably the best outcome we could realistically hope for right now. The flip side, if you will, the worst case there, what's the most challenging outcome that we might realistically have to face? Probably that the virus remains widespread and people keep getting sick. New people keep getting sick. And so we have to keep physical distancing orders in place for a more extended period of time. And then, what's most likely to happen? Okay, so let's say that conditions continue to slowly improve. But physical distancing orders are relaxing. In spite of that, people choose to stay out of crowded places. They choose to avoid travel. That's the most likely that you might reach for. Now, here's the trick about this whole exercise. Right now, easily half of you who are listening, maybe more people, are saying, that's not the best case. That's not the worst case. Why didn't you think of this? Why didn't you think of that? It's because it's an unknown, right? We don't actually know what the best, worst, and most likely scenario is. So everybody's opinion about what goes in this chart is going to be slightly different. So don't get yourself into a circular conversation with your board and your staff members trying to make this chart perfect. Just come up with a scenario in each box that everybody can live with. You're not going to get 100% agreement, and that's okay. You don't need it to complete the exercise. The idea here is to just settle on some projections that feel right. Once you've got those projections in each box for each of your unknown factors, you use those to build your scenarios. This might actually be the most challenging part of the exercise because you're trying to combine the different conditions that you're predicting to make a scenario that you might actually have to face. None of those unknowns happen in a vacuum, right? They're all happening at the same time and they're all interacting with each other. You might have identified 3 or 4 unknowns, which could give you, 9 or 12 boxes to be working with. So don't think that what I'm saying here is you have to do a scenario that combines each possible condition for each possible unknown. Don't do that. Pick, 2, 3. You could go to 4 if you wanted, but if you needed to do more, I would say you got to work a little bit more on those unknowns to figure out what's really important. So make some combinations that seem most important for your organization. So for example, here on the slide, maybe you get most likely under physical distancing, but maybe you get a worst case under philanthropy, right? That the stock market stays weak and that ultimately creates problems for foundations and corporations in their giving. So that could be a scenario that you might actually have to face. So you want to just pull a few of these conditions together to make what seems like a realistic prediction of something that might happen. Then you're able to use that prediction to figure out what you might do. This is the strategic part of it, right? Instead of trying to make a strategy that will work in all conditions, just think about this set of conditions. Gives you a little bit of a box to work in, which helps reduce the impact of uncertainty on your thinking. So for example, if we were working with the scenario we just said, right, about physical distancing in the stock market, and let's say you had a fundraiser plan for the fall, you might need to think about how you're going to postpone it or change it or move it online. There can also be opportunities in this moment, right? So if people are going to be home more in the fall, then maybe you have a program that you haven't put online yet, and maybe you could, and maybe you could even charge for it. So that might be an opportunity you'd be able to take advantage of that wouldn't have been available to you in a different scenario. So it's important to think about responding to negative conditions. Also, go ahead and take a minute and respond to opportunities that might come up. That'll help you make a more cohesive plan. And then this is when you bring your trigger events back in. So you've got your trigger events for this scenario. Might be, are people gathering in crowds yet? So you might set a date of, say, like, we got to look at what's happening in mid-August. And if people still aren't gathering in crowds, then we got to figure out what to do about the November fundraiser. You can set financial targets. The money does play into this, right? So if foundation revenue starts to dip below a certain level for a year, then we have to think about some harder choices around programming or staff. The idea here is to both know roughly what you're going to do if these conditions come into place, and also when you're going to accept that these conditions are happening. So all of these scenarios, however many you do, are meant to allow you to shape if-then plans, right? So if a certain set of conditions happen, then you're going to know what to do. Obviously, scenario plans are not static, right? You're going to keep updating them as conditions change, but at least you'll have something to work with instead of feeling like every day you have to make new decisions. You'll have a set of plans that you can keep refining based on what actually happens. All of this will be more effective, as we said at the beginning, if you continue to focus on your mission, your constituents, and your long-range goals for your organization's impact. If you just make your scenario plans based on money, you're going to wind up in a situation where you are less effective than you could be, right? So keep the big picture in front of you as you are making these scenario choices so that you can keep making a difference. It's what all of us do best in the nonprofit sector, and it's what the community really needs from us right now. So I hope you'll find this scenario planning tool useful. It's particularly useful to have some structure for the complicated conversations you're having with your board and your staff right now. I would also remind you, when you're thinking about how finances affect your organization, also make sure that your mission and your current strategic plan are in the mix in those conversations. If you bring those forward in your conversations, you're much more likely to wind up in a place of long-term organizational stability. And you're also much more likely to be able to keep being a positive influence in your community, even as circumstances remain challenging. So I wish you and your organization much success as you are navigating these challenging times, and I hope you and your families stay well. Again, I'm Allison Trimarco from Creative Capacity Consulting. Thanks to Volunteer Connect for asking me to be here with you today. Be well.